A new survey on national pride and identity in Singapore reveals that most residents support globalisation, but half of them worry about job competition from immigrants. Researchers from the Institute of Policy Studies surveyed over 2,000 citizens and permanent residents last year. They found that 4 in 5 respondents view globalisation positively and that immigration is generally good for the economy. But a little over half also feel that immigrants are taking away jobs. The researchers also note respondents who are lower educated and from a lower socio-economic status are more likely to see immigrants as an economic threat.
The implication here is that I think we need to calibrate our immigration policy. We have to ensure that we bring in the people that we really need. And also, of course, at the same time, that Singaporeans are not discriminated against, that they have a fair chance. If they are equally qualified or better qualified, they should be hired.
Nearly 2/3 of respondents think that some Singaporeans are more advantaged than others. Younger and more educated respondents are also more likely to perceive Singapore society as being less equal. And though over 70% think that Singapore's approach to multi-racialism works well, more minorities and younger respondents believe that improvements can still be made. But when it comes to identity, a clear majority put their country and race as important as their own sense of identity. Over 2/3 also say they're proud of the country's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, but they also still see it and the economic downturn as the greatest threats to Singapore's future. Now, for more on this study, we're joined by Dr Mathew Mathews from the Institute of Policy Studies. Dr Mathews, thanks for joining us. Firstly, what makes up the Singapore identity and pride, and how far-reaching were the effects of the pandemic on Singaporeans' view of it?
Well, thank you very much for having me on the show. Singapore identity and pride have quite a lot to do with the institutions that we have. Strong governance, the structures, the principles, the values, which are so much embedded within our society. So the pandemic has likely elicited clearer views of identity. People possibly have become more grateful about a society where we value the collective, the rule of law, equality, tolerance, and sometimes when individual freedoms and expressions are not necessarily the first priority. And this is what you need, especially during the pandemic, because you want at least number of people to be ill, to die. You need to have some kind of restraints. And you also need to have strong institutions. And a very big part of how Singaporeans identify or see their identity is and what they take pride in is the fact that we have got strong institutions which do a good job and manage and direct people during this period. And also you notice that this identity that we have, this identity that we've built during the pandemic, identity that we care for people, irregardless of their statuses, and there's an interest to volunteer and care. I mean, all those are very much part of how I think the pandemic has shaped quite a bit of identity.
On social cohesion, Dr Mathews, the survey shows that a majority feel that Singapore's approach to multi-racialism, it works well, but there is clearly perception of inequality as well. So how deep-rooted is this issue of inequality, and where are the biggest gaps?
Well, I mean, just even for the point about multiracialism, just to put in some context, you do notice that even among, in general, you do have people who believe that multiracialism works well, but among minorities, there are still some concerns that multiracialism can be improved further. When it comes to inequality, do know that when people were asked between the question of, the statements, all Singaporeans are equally able to succeed in Singapore, or some Singaporeans have more advantages in achieving success, you see it clearly weighted towards this idea that people do recognize that some Singaporeans are more advantaged. And I know some of the biggest gaps can be seen if you think about the education system, and people might be looking at that when they think about this. So you start off, you've got a family which has more wealth and income, they pass on some of their advantages, their children have more opportunities. That's very much part of the system. And you can't possibly stop people who have got advantages from passing it on. And of course, I think that's something that I think has come to many people's mind, and it's one of those gaps in how we have been dealing with inequality.
Yeah, staying with minorities, your study also shows that minorities have a stronger dual sense of racial and national identity. They feel closer to their racial group, but tend to be less positive about racial equality. Now, what do you make of this trend, and what can be done about it?
Well, to start off with, I think it's a good thing to have a dual sense of both a strong sense of connection to your racial identities and your national identities. You don't want to be in a case where people have strong racial identities but don't have a national identity. I mean, that happens. I mean, that can be read as marginalization. You're marginalized from society itself. I mean, all your only connections are with people of your same racial background. And of course, on the other hand, if you just have a national identity and no racial identity, then sometimes people suppose that somehow or another that racial identity has been suppressed or, I mean, unfairly removed from you. So there needs to be that kind of, I guess, some kind of balance here. Now, of course, if you think about the fact that when minorities, when they look at racial equality, being in a multi-racial society, and of course they do observe some of the inequalities that happen, maybe at the job level, for instance, and you notice that sometimes access to shine may not be there. Sometimes workplaces may prefer or may choose people based on their racial backgrounds. Not always, but certainly there's a portion of that. And of course, then minorities think about being in a multiracial society like Singapore, where there's a strong affirmation of the pledge, for instance, where we affirm that we're regardless of race, language, and religion. So, of course, then they hold society up to a higher standard and expect that, you know, we need to expect this kind of equality.
Dr. Mathews, give us some context here. How reflective of society are the four clusters your team profiled the respondents into? And what more perhaps can be done to better engage groups like the Concerned Patriots and Dispassionate Citizens?
Well, I mean, we did have four groups, and I mean, one big group is, of course, what we call the proud idealist, and those, and it's a very big portion of 40-something percent, those who are loyally committed to Singapore, generally supportive of what Singapore does and represents. And of course, you've got this group called the Concerned Patriots. So they are loyal, they're committed, but they can also be critical of fellow Singaporeans. I mean, they make a smaller portion of the study. What you have is another big portion is what they call the moderate idealists. So they have a more balanced view of Singapore and Singaporeans. And maybe a greater tentativeness to the identity commitment. And you've got a small group, which we call the dispassionate citizens, which, you know, some are a bit more apathetic about things, maybe even marginalized. These classes are somewhat intuitive. You know, concerned patriots aren't really a cause for concern. These are people who are fundamentally supportive of Singapore, although they might come across as critical. And it's important to hear them out because they do have, do have concerns, and sometimes they would need information. You also need to have more thoughtful engagement to those we consider moderate idealists, because they've got a level of identity commitment. They find a way to engage this group meaningfully, harness their strengths very often. This group has better education, better socio-economic statuses, and they can have their skills can be very valuable to the broader community.
Dr. Mathews, always good to hear your views. Thank you for joining us there. Dr. Mathew Mathews, head of the IPS Social Lab at the Institute of Policy Studies.